a steel drum sealed in concrete, sat quietly at the edge of Tokyo's wastelands. Inside was the body of a 17-year-old girl who had vanished weeks earlier. For 40 days, she was held captive in a home filled with laughter and music while she endured a nightmare no one stopped. This case is about a girl who vanished without a sound on an ordinary November evening in Tokyo. Her name was Junko Furuta. She was 17, smart, focused, kind. She had just finished her part-time shift and was riding her bike home through the fading light of a quiet suburb. The streets were familiar. The sky was low and gray. There was nothing to suggest danger. But she never made it back. She was approached by a teenage boy named Hiroshi Miyano. He was older, known for trouble. With a polished smile and the confidence of someone who had manipulated before, he offered to walk her home after pretending to help her. What seemed like kindness quickly became something else. Behind it was a plan, one designed not just to harm, but to erase her entirely. Junko was taken to a house in Tokyo's Adachi ward. It was an average home in a dense residential block where neighbors lived shoulder to shoulder, where the walls were thin and the air always carried sound. Inside that house, she was held against her will. What followed was a 40-day ordeal, carried out not in darkness or isolation, but in plain view. The family who lived there did not intervene. Friends of the boys came and went. Music played. Laughter was heard. Behind the closed door of a second-floor bedroom, Junko suffered repeated acts of cruelty and psychological torment. Her personal safety was violated again and again. She tried to escape more than once, but every attempt ended in more violence. She begged for her life. She begged to go home. No one listened. Outside the house, the world moved forward. School bells rang. New Year's lights were strung across storefronts. But inside that home, Junko was slowly disappearing. When she died in early January, her body was already broken. The boys placed her remains in an oil drum. They poured concrete over her and left her in a landfill surrounded by rusted scrap and chemical haze. No one knew where she was until months later. A police officer questioning one of the boys about a different incident heard something he was not expecting. A slip in the story. A mistake. That error cracked open the truth. What they found was not just a body. It was evidence of silence, of failure, of a community that looked the other way until it was far too late. The house was small, 2 stories of aging concrete, tucked into a neighborhood of quiet streets and rust-colored rooftops in Tokyo's Adachi ward. On the outside, it looked like any other home. Inside, the air was thick. The upstairs room where Junko was kept grew darker with each passing day. The curtains rarely opened. The walls held noise like a sponge, loud footsteps, muffled laughter, the mechanical sound of a television playing long into the night. Beneath it all, something far more sinister was unfolding. Junko Furuta had been dragged into a life she did not choose. Her captors were 4 boys, teenagers, each one known to police, each one steeped in a violent subculture tied to organized street crime. The ringleader, Hiroshi Miyano, was already feared in his community. He had ties to the Yakuza. He used those ties as leverage. People listened when he threatened. People obeyed when he spoke. The boys convinced others that Junko was a runaway, someone without a voice, someone no one was looking for. This lie gave them time. Over 40 days, that time was used to inflict prolonged harm. Every hour brought new cruelty. Junko was denied food and water for long stretches. When she was given something to eat, it was often spoiled. Her hands were burned, her face bruised beyond recognition. She was subjected to constant physical abuse. The boys treated her not as a person, but as something disposable. She tried to get help, more than once. There are reports that she managed to get to a telephone. She dialed for emergency services, but before she could speak, she was caught, punished again. The boys laughed. They mocked her. She was forced to act as if she were staying with them by choice, to smile when the door opened, to say the right things if a stranger passed by. The room itself began to change. The floor stained. The air grew heavy with the smell of unwashed clothes and damp concrete. The window stayed shut even when the heat swelled. Time bent inside that space. Days lost their meaning. Junko's body weakened, her injuries compounded. At one point, she could no longer stand. Even then, the abuse did not stop. Her health deteriorated so rapidly that by the final week, she was unrecognizable from the girl who had once pedaled her bike home in the evening light. There were visitors. Teenagers from the area came in and out. Some watched, some participated, others said nothing and left. The house was not isolated. It sat on a residential street. Neighbors were close enough to hear. Reports later revealed that sounds were heard, cries, bangs. Someone called the police once. Officers arrived. They were told it was a misunderstanding, that a family issue had gotten loud. They left without asking further questions. The parents of one of the boys lived in the same house. They saw her. One reportedly believed she was a girlfriend who had nowhere else to go. Another suspected the truth, but feared the consequences of speaking out. Silence became its own kind of violence. It wrapped around Junko like a second prison. By the 35th day, Junko was unconscious for long stretches. Her body was no longer healing. Her fingers were broken. Her internal injuries were extensive. On the final night, the boys reportedly inflicted a beating more severe than any before. They claimed she was not responsive. She was cold to the touch. In the morning, she was gone. What followed was mechanical, cold. Her body was placed inside a large steel drum. Concrete was mixed and poured over her. The drum was sealed and taken to a desolate industrial landfill in Tokyo's Kodo district. It was dumped among rusted metal and decaying garbage, a final act meant to erase her completely. For weeks, no one knew what had happened. Her family continued searching. Her classmates handed out flyers. Her face became a photo on posters taped to subway stations and school gates. There were no leads, no witnesses, no confirmed sightings, only silence. Then, in March of 1989, one of the boys was arrested in an unrelated case. During questioning, an officer made a passing comment about an unsolved murder. The boy assumed they knew. He laughed. He confessed. Not because he was remorseful, but because he thought the secret was already out. What he revealed stunned the room. Investigators followed his lead. The drum was found. The concrete cracked open. And what they saw would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The building action of this case is not one of sudden violence. It is one of slow, deliberate cruelty, of a community that failed to act, of a system that failed to protect. The tension is not in a single event, but in the accumulation of horrors that took place in broad daylight. Junko Furuta was not hidden in a forest or shackled in a basement. She was there, in a house with people, in a city that kept moving, and that is what makes this case so hard to look away from. It did not happen in the shadows. It happened in plain sight. It was January 4th, 1989. The room was no longer a room, it was a cell. The air inside was stale and sour, thick with the residue of 40 days of human suffering. The walls absorbed the stench of blood, sweat, rot, and despair. The carpet had hardened in places where the floor had been soaked too many times. Light barely reached the space. A small bulb overhead flickered now and then, but mostly hung dim and steady, casting long shadows across the cluttered floor. The temperature inside was colder than usual. The heat had been turned off. No blankets had been given. Junko Furuta lay still. Her body was brittle, her skin marked with deep bruises, blistered burns, open wounds, and signs of severe infection. She had not been able to move without assistance for days. Her breathing was faint, her lips dry and cracked, her voice almost completely gone. That morning, the boys grew irritated. One of them claimed she had been too slow to respond. Another said she had caused a mess that needed to be cleaned up. Their frustration built quickly. This was not rage and defense. This was cruelty fueled by boredom. Reports later confirmed that Junko was beaten with a heavy object that day. Her abdomen was struck repeatedly. They dropped dumbbells onto her chest. They kicked her. They stomped on her body while she lay unconscious. They poured flammable liquid over her skin and set fire to her legs. The flames reached her hands and shoulders. She did not scream. She was already drifting beyond pain. In the hours that followed, the boys noticed she was no longer responsive. They threw a blanket over her body and left her in the room. She was not given medical help. She was not checked on again that day. Later that night, when one of them returned to the room, the space was quiet. Her breathing had stopped. She was 17. When they realized she was dead, panic did not set in the way it should have. There was no immediate rush to alert authorities, no breakdown, no remorse. Instead, they discussed how to get rid of her. Her body was wrapped in layers of fabric and plastic. The drum was already in the house, a large steel container, roughly 4 feet tall. They placed her inside and began mixing concrete. It was done using basic tools, a bag of powder, buckets of water. The process was slow, messy. They poured until her body was submerged and sealed the lid tightly. They let it sit for a full day. Then, 2 of the boys rented a truck and drove the drum to a landfill in Tokyo's Koto district. It was an isolated site used for industrial dumping. The sky was low and gray when they arrived. The ground was damp from recent rain. They found a spot between piles of metal scrap and decaying waste. There, they left her. Junko Furuta was listed as a missing person. Her parents searched without rest. Flyers were taped to utility poles and train stations. Her classmates left her seat empty in the classroom, hoping she would return. Her name was read on the school intercom every week, but there were no clues, no witnesses, no signs of foul play. For nearly 2 months, the truth remained buried. Then, in late March, everything shifted. Police arrested one of the boys, not for Junko's disappearance, but for an unrelated violent encounter. During questioning, an officer made an offhand reference to another murder case they were investigating. Something clicked in the boy's mind. He thought they already knew. What he said next stunned the room. He admitted there was another body. He told them where to find it. He told them she was inside a drum. Investigators moved quickly. When they arrived at the landfill, the area was eerily quiet. Seagulls circled overhead. The smell of rust and decay choked the air. They found the drum exactly where he said it would be. Its surface was caked in dried concrete. It took hours to cut it open. What they found inside was unspeakable. The concrete held a frozen shape of her body. Her limbs were contorted. Her clothes were torn and fused with her skin. The forensic team could not identify her through conventional means. Dental records confirmed what the state of the body had already made clear. It was Junko Furuta, the girl who never came home, the girl the world forgot for 40 days. The autopsy revealed devastating details. Her injuries were consistent with sustained, long-term abuse. Multiple fractures, internal trauma, signs of repeated blunt force impact, evidence of severe dehydration and starvation. She weighed barely 70 pounds. Her body bore the unmistakable marks of a violation of bodily autonomy. Reports also noted a possible pregnancy at the time of death. News of the discovery broke across Japan like a wave of cold air. The public was horrified. Journalists camped outside the police station. Crowds gathered near the family's home. Schools issued statements of mourning. Parliament members called for an emergency review of juvenile criminal law. Protesters stood outside the courthouse demanding justice. But for Junko's parents, none of that mattered. Their daughter had died alone, forgotten, in a room surrounded by people who did nothing. That moment, when the concrete cracked and her body was revealed to the world, that was the climax, the turning point that made this case unforgettable. It was no longer just a mystery. It was a mirror held to a society that had failed to protect the innocent in its own backyard. Junko's body was laid to rest, but the silence she left behind never settled. Her home remained quiet, her bedroom untouched. School yearbooks with her photo were closed and placed on shelves that gathered dust. Classmates who once shared lunches with her could not speak of her in full sentences. Some never returned to school. Others avoided eye contact when her name was mentioned. The pain sat beneath the surface, like water trapped under ice. The boys who took her life did not vanish. They served reduced sentences and re-entered society under protected identities. Some committed new crimes. Their names changed, but their shadows remained. Reporters followed them for years. Each sighting brought renewed anger, but no new answers. Apologies were never offered. Regret was never seen. The courtroom felt colder because of it. Her parents stopped speaking to the press. They were tired. Their lives had been hollowed out by whispers, by headlines, by the weight of her absence in every room. The house where it all happened still stands. The neighbors remember. Some cross the street when they pass it. Others look up at the second floor and then quickly look away. No memorial marks the spot, no plaque. Just a plain structure with peeling paint and a window that does not open. Inside, the layout is unchanged. The floorboards creak in the same places. The bedroom still smells faintly of mildew and concrete dust. In the landfill where the drum was found, the wind moves slowly. Rusted machines sit abandoned. Metal groans under the weight of time. There is no sign of her there anymore, only the memory of something heavy being left behind. And in the minds of those who remember her, that weight never lifted. It waits quietly, like cold air pressing against the back of your neck when no one else is in the room. The parents in that house never faced charges. The officers who visited during her captivity filed no report. Neighbors who heard screams offered no statements. The other teenagers who passed through that room were never named. The school never received a confirmed tip. Her belongings were returned in a single box. Inside was her uniform, carefully folded. The collar still faintly smelled of cigarette smoke,